Welcome back to the Six Ps podcast. We have a very special edition today. I've got a very special guest with me to discuss our comparative texts in the Crucible and the Dressmaker. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi there. I'm Elizabeth Chesterfield, and it's great to be back.
Yes, and you joined us a few months ago now when we discussed the film Rear Window.
Sure did.
But we're back to discuss the comparative texts, which are new for this year. Well, the Dressmaker is new for this year. We've said goodbye to Year of Wonders. On the same year that we deal with the pandemic, we get rid of a book about a pandemic. So
it does seem like an interesting choice, doesn't it, Jim? I can't say that I agree with Vika's choice there, but the Dressmaker has a lot to offer us, and that's what we'll be looking at today anyway. Forwards.
Indeed. So today we're just going to have pretty much a discussion about both the texts and just run through some ideas and how we might connect the two texts together. Both the similarities, and something that we always say that we forget quite often is the differences between the texts, which are easy to forget because subconsciously we're always looking to how can we connect the two, but it's also about the differences. So I guess for you, we've done the Crucible a couple of times, what stands out to you as being your favourite part about the Crucible?
I think my favorite part, if I had to choose a moment, and I'll take this in two bits, my favorite moment is obviously when Giles Corey says the immortal line of heart on Thomas Putnam. But leaving that aside, I think what I like about it is its sort of dual setting in terms of addressing both the HUAC and McCarthy trials that Arthur Miller was commenting upon, as well as the Salem trials as well. That obviously continues to be relevant in terms of its themes of persecution and the ways in which we often seek opportunities to enact revenge upon people, which is sort of the baser aspects of human nature, as well as people who manage to effectively resist that.
Yeah, and I think it's so apt in today's world when Miller references things like when individualism sort of overtakes a sense of community, that's when there's chaos, and we've seen that in the world over the past 6 months. And some of his points are still pertinent. Isn't that so interesting that someone writing in the 1950s about something that happened in 1692 is still relevant today?
Absolutely. And one of the things that another individual drew my attention to when we first started studying the Crucible is that historically a lot of these witch trials ended up occurring when there was a bit of a power vacuum and individuals saw an opportunity to take advantage of that. So I think one of the things we were discussing the other day was the fact that it's Deputy Governor Danforth. He's not the actual governor. And so filling into that power vacuum where the governor is absent is, I think, something Miller puts there but doesn't overplay.
And that's something for you definitely to consider when you're doing your analysis. Is this historical context is really rich. We're dealing with real, they are characters, but they are real in so much as, and the text begins with that note to the historical accuracy of the play. This actually happened, and is one of the key differences, or the core differences for me, between this text and say the Dressmaker, which is far more fictional. So the social and historical context of the play is so important, and something that I definitely encourage you all to look into. And I guess when we talk about Puritanism, that's also something that plays a significant role in the text.
Absolutely. And I think looking at the ways in which members of the Puritan community are either inside Salem or outside Salem, the ways in which some are within the church or without the church, covenanted, non-covenanted, I think it's something that you don't want to ham up too much, but it's something that you can draw your attention to and inform your understanding of the characters and the world in which they're moving.
I guess the other thing that when I think about the Crucible is I do think about Elizabeth and John Proctor, and I think that really powerful scene in Act 3, and it's actually part of the film that I really like. I'm not massive on the film, it drags on a little bit, but when Elizabeth Proctor in that moment has to decide to lie to what she thinks is protecting her husband, or to confess that her husband is a lecher, is so powerful and strikes to the very core of who we are as human beings.
Yeah, and I think it's so brutal, isn't it, that, you know, this one time that this paragon of virtue chooses to lie, and it's because she's viewing this as protecting her husband and protecting her family, and that protective impulse is ultimately what damns them. Is such a brutal moment to watch or to read.
And I guess that last act, when they had that scene, they, two of the last characters to sort of speak, when she sort of says, no, I can't, I'm not going to stop him. Like, I won't. He has his goodness now. Is again a really powerful moment, and sort of shows us again that aspect of morality and how that's almost, for John Proctor, that's more important than even his life, and how his wife accepts that. And we talk about, it's a nice little link about acceptance to the Dressmaker, but how relationships based on acceptance and trust are so important.
Absolutely, and it's an interesting sort of mirror, and I think it's what makes the Crucible quite interesting is that Miller doesn't have just one sort of through line to say about individualism. So in those moments, both of the Proctors are standing against what their community is urging them to do, because it's with their personal relationship with God and with morality, standing against that.
So that leads us in nicely to talk about the Dressmaker, and I'm curious to know the part about the Dressmaker that stands out for you.
I think I keep coming back to the idea of revenge again and again, because obviously the ending of this text is so incandescent.
Ooh, yes. Put that in your essays.
Yes. But the sort of subtle ways in which revenge and vengeance manifests, and the idea that so many of these people are small-minded and not able to let these things go. But even our protagonist returns to the place of this trauma and returns to this place where she is unable to let these things go, and obviously burns everything down.
So that's a good segue, because we've had this discussion before, and it's one that I think you should definitely have in your own classrooms, is can we justify Tilly's actions at the end of the text? So, spoiler alert for those of you who haven't read it, but should of course have read it. The play does close with Tilly burning down her house and most of the village, most of the town, apart from Windswept Crest, the Beaumont's place, thus sort of destroying the town physically. What are your thoughts on whether Tilly is justified in her actions?
As someone who obviously is not originally from Australia, it does strike me as a particularly brutal choice of revenge in terms of its form, and seems to be almost like a attempt at a divine punishment, one of those sort of plagues sent down.
Yeah, that's good. I like that, yeah.
But obviously it's a human enacting it, which is inherently problematic, that, she's seeking this retribution in that way. So I'm not entirely comfortable with it, and I'm not sure that we're meant to be. I don't know.
Interesting. It's. I think it's a point that we should look to argue both ways, really, and we really want to be flexible with our analysis, because we don't know what the essay question will be on. But I feel like, because there's a few reasons why I think Tilly is justified, and I think that's done through Rosalie Ham's storytelling. We do get flashbacks to what happened to Tilly as a child, and then also as an adult. So it's the verbal abuse, which we see from both the children and the adults. It's the physical abuse as well, from both Pettymans, both Stuart Pettyman when she was a child, and then when Evan does it to her when he spits on her at the ball. And because we get an insight into that far more depth and detail than we find out about any of the other characters, really, about their previous lives and their current lives, I think Ham does want us to an extent to understand Tilly's actions. But you're right, it is a horrendous act that does destroy almost an entire town. The Beaumont's house is not destroyed, and that's, in a way, it's ironic, because Elspeth Beaumont, who thinks she's better than the town, who quote unquote had heirs, who says this place that doesn't agree with me has to take in everyone. And even the fact that the women in the town, when they go to Tilly, the one thing they say is, I need to look better than Elspeth. There clearly is tension there. So I kind of like that aspect of it, but I don't think these characters, and that's what they are characters, I don't think they learn anything from what they've done, which is why I feel uncomfortable about the ending as well.
And I don't know that there's all that much scope for them to learn anything, because their destruction is so total. I mean, even the money that was set aside for them to rebuild, for them to start again, perhaps if we're going to have a shred of optimism, having learned something from their trials and tribulations, that money's gone. So the destruction of these people's livelihoods, their town, is so complete and total that it does seem a bit of a bleak ending for everybody, bar our radiant protagonist. Yeah.
The other thing, I guess, with the ending, and we'll talk about the Crucible's ending in a moment as well, but Tilly arrives at night, in the middle of the night, in darkness, and she leaves during the day. So the idea, and dark and light comes up a lot throughout both texts. It's a nice little stylistic comparison that you can sort of make between the texts. Is there, so that also provides me with that idea that, okay, maybe, no, she's leaving to a better place, and there is a sense of hope for Tilly, but maybe not for the town. It's interesting.
Well, and I think the ways in which, I like that movement from dark to light, to consider the context around what light and fire mean in an Australian context. Coming from a North American context, a lot of things around sun and fire are very positive because it's quite chilly a lot of the year, whereas here that fire is very dangerous, and that dangerous aspect is highlighted by the setting. So moving from darkness to danger, I don't know, although she's leaving.
She is leaving, so. Yeah. But look, fire's a great symbol to look at. It does link in well with the Crucible as well, being a crucible, and the heat and the fire within the courtroom that Judge Danforth references as well. I did want to touch on the endings though. So we get this a little bit jarring ending in The Dressmaker. There is a sense of justice there though. Let's talk about the ending of The Crucible. How do you find it?
I find it very sad. The epilogue I kind of like. In terms of, I kind of like that, Abigail robs her uncle and becomes a sex worker, allegedly.
Yes.
The legend has it. Echoes Down the Corridor, I think, is such an evocative title for that, in terms of the idea that these people's lives don't end there. There's not that finality. There's a suggestion that, and Miller makes this comment and point a few times throughout the play, that these people are the progenitors of the Americans who are seeing this play, that this is where they've come from, this is where their society is built on, and that we need to not forget that, which again connects with his context around HUAC and McCarthy, that this sort of wheels within wheels keep wheeling along for the foreseeable future. But leaving aside that epilogue, because obviously it's quite short, it's a devastating sort of ending, with Hale having progressed to the point where he no longer believes in what he's been doing, and the moral victory being one of death.
Yeah, and that's something that you should definitely look to analyse as well, is what message is the audience left with. And to an extent, we are proud of John Proctor, but nonetheless it's poignant, it's sad. That he has to sacrifice his life, that it's sort of come to this, that he made that one mistake which he regrets, and that's what costs him his life. And as human beings ourselves, we are prone to making mistakes, and what the consequences of those are can be quite significant. And I think you mentioned the references there to 1950s and McCarthyism, and that's perfectly illustrated here when you have these corrupt governments and corrupt systems that, there's no one there to oversee them, how dangerous the consequences can be. And we don't know that 3 years after this, he was questioned by HUAC. And for me, the allegorical nature of this text is something that I would definitely be studying, and that historical context is so rich.
Absolutely. Miller talking about the inability for the Puritans to be able to seek absolution, I think really nicely connects with what you're drawing attention to, is one sin one mistake, you don't have, because this form of Christianity has rejected the ability to seek absolution from a priest, but also from one another. And Proctor seeks this a number of times from Elizabeth, and each time she says, it's up to you. You have to forgive yourself. God has to forgive you. I cannot function in that role, which both damns and saves him. Damns him to die, but he is able to save his soul with the choices he makes at the end. And I think that connects to that Puritan context really nicely.
Beautiful. Any characters from the Crucible? I mean, we've got the Proctors, who I think most students like to focus on. Is there a character, and Danforth too, I should say. Those are the three core ones I think that we see a lot of. Is there any other character you think is underutilised or under-analysed by students?
If I can be completely biased because he's my favourite character, my favourite character is Giles Corey. Yeah. I love Giles Corey. He does have my favourite quote of the play.
Yes.
Obviously, apart from Thomas Putnam. But more than that, he's a wonderfully sort of nuanced character. He's a litigious individual. And there's a lovely little bit of banter between him and John Proctor, saying, well, you can't sue me for saying you're deaf, and like all of that kind of thing. There's no ill will there, I think, between the two of them, even though he sued John Proctor.
Yeah.
And he's been in the courts so many times. He acts as a little bit, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say he acts in the role of a fool in terms of exposing truths, as a fool does in Lear and things like that. But he's a little bit silly, and he stumbles into his accusing his wife. He doesn't mean to. He's just confused as to why is she reading these books? I don't get it. And yet, yeah. And
it's funny because in Miller's authorial interjection, when he introduces Giles Corey, he goes, he was really old and he just learned his prayers. So it made sense that, of course, he would stop prayer. And Martha Corey, unfortunately for her sake, she does end up dying. But isn't it so powerful how... And the Dressmaker does have these comedic moments. I think that's what sets it apart, quite obviously, from the Crucible. But Giles Corey does provide that sense of relief for the audience when he comes into the text a couple of times, especially in Act 3 when he's so confused. When Danforth sort of says, yes, my father must have mentioned you at some stage. But how powerful is it? He's the one who isn't hanged. He has a different punishment. He's pressed to death. And it's that weight that he feels for betraying his wife and betraying his friends. And he doesn't want to do that again. I will not give you no name. I mentioned my wife's name once, and I'll burn in hell long enough for that. I stand mute. It does raise him as similar to John Proctor. It raises his character and his moral integrity, which I think is so important to him, just like it is for John Proctor. Any characters from the Dressmaker? So this is our first year doing it, and from what I can sense at the moment, we've dipped our toe in so far. Tilly is going to be discussed a bit, and I sort of think that I'm curious to know where kids will go from there. I think Teddy's someone to look at quite closely, and I think the relationship between the two is really important because as I compare it to John and Elizabeth, I think John and Elizabeth, their plot revolves around the rebuilding of trust, whereas for Tilly and Teddy, it's about building trust, particularly from Tilly's perspective, which we gain most insight to. Are there characters who you gravitate towards in the Dressmaker?
Yeah, I really like Irma Almanac and also Marigold Pettyman. I think those two characters function really well along with Mad Molly as the women taken advantage of and exploited, and I do get more of a vicarious thrill from their bits of revenge than I do necessarily from Tilly's, and I think the sort of empowerment, if you want to use that word, of these women, or the revelations and processes they go through to have the scales fall from their eyes and all the rest of it, I think is a really nice move.
I think when Irma and Molly are talking, there's a great line about how they were connected, and one of the ways they're connected, unfortunately, is through abusive men, and how poignant that really is. There is a nice sense, well, I guess with Molly firstly, the fact that she is the most open and honest character in the text. And yes, she's mad, And of course she's mad because she's been isolated for such a long time. It's absolutely understandable that without her, apart from May and Irma, no one goes to visit her. Even Sgt Ferrat doesn't, and that actually embarrasses him.
Yeah.
When he's with Tilly. But Molly speaks the truth, and of course, and we love our names in the Dressmaker, but Lois Pickett, as Molly says, she picks her scabs and eats them. Nice little bit of visual there for you.
Oh, delightful. Yeah.
Edits at
Edit.
22:18. Cool. But
yeah.
I guess the characters, and I think you've made a really good point here about that female empowerment, which is so important in this text, and we see it slightly differently in the Crucible, but it is still there through Abigail. But that idea of ironic justice in that Marigold's revenge and Irma's revenge, which is less conscious,
Quite
but
literally.
still, yeah, thanks to some lovely brownies
Yes.
from Tilly. But that scene, particularly with Marigold, is, for her anyway, she manages to take control over this awful, awful man and exact that revenge, which, as readers, we understand, I think, as readers, that her actions, and it is also ironic because it's through the Marigolds that Evan becomes impotent as well.
Yes.
So there's that double layer there.
Yep.
And again, we've got the name
Yes.
playing a role. Any other characters who you gravitate towards?
I was just thinking about those women and Mad Molly just before I think about someone else, is that I think him may be commenting upon this really common trope when dealing with women of, oh, she's crazy. Do you know, like the fobbing off of female concerns and sensitivities towards things like abuse and violence, which are so embedded in patriarchal societies, that dismissive attitude is, again, embedded in her name. We don't listen to her, even though she is our Cassandra, our truth teller, because that would require breaking down the hierarchical power structure that they've built up. And Ham says it, and I'll look for the quote in just a moment, but that the men, when she's describing how the men interact, they put up with him because of his role as a counselor. The women try to not be left alone with him and don't turn their backs on him because he's not to be trusted. It's the if you look up the broken stair theory, it's that that everybody knows it, but we can't acknowledge it, because to do so we'd have to have some pretty tough conversations.
Yeah, 100%. And isn't that, for this society, for rural society, how, and Ham is saying this is what life is like in any rural town in 1950s Australia. It's Tilly and Molly who are condemned and not Evan.
Absolutely.
And the way that she sort of depicts that through those really good quotations is that perfect snapshot of this is what's expected because everyone conforms. Yeah,
and the fact that in order for society to move smoothly, you need to ignore certain things. And I think we see that's the dark side of that ignoring of problems. But the plus side is Sgt Ferrat. Like, otherwise, society wouldn't just move as smoothly if he enforced closing times on the pub or if he ratted out all the people cheating on each other. So
there's a lot of that, isn't there?
So much of that. A certain amount of ignorance needs to be maintained, but we also see the flip side of where that goes.
Yeah. Speaking of Sgt Ferrat or Sgt Ferrat, I never know what to say. I of course say Ferrat and it sounds so...
like he's a ferret.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on Sgt Ferrat?
I kind of fear that, having seen the movie before I read the book, the novel, I like him more than I would had I solely read the novel. Yeah. But I like him. He's a sort of very, not quite persnickety, but very precise individual in a lot of ways. I like his secret life in terms of why he's been exiled from Melbourne and him pursuing that anyway.
Yeah. I like the word precise. Hale uses the word precise. The devil is precise.
He does.
And I think precise is a word used to describe Puritans too, from memory. Historically, they've been called precise. I think that might be from Much Ado About Nothing, potentially, that I'm getting that from.
Oh.
Bit of intertextuality, which we'll get to with the Dressmaker, of course.
Oh, yes. We'll have to have a special series on Shakespeare and the Dressmaker.
Yeah. I think you're right with the film, and Hugo Weaving plays a really big role in that. And he's a really likeable character. But when he first arrives in the novel, there's tension between the two of them. There's tension between Tilly and Sgt Ferrat. When he drives her up to the hill, she gets these moments and she feels, and it's repeated a couple of times, the knot in her stomach tightens because she remembers what it was like being driven by him leaving the town. And then at the end, I don't know what you think about this, but the fact that she burns his clothes at the end, what do you reckon that means in terms of their relationship?
Yeah, I think it really emphasizes, as you say, that that she remembers that abdication of responsibility, that inability or unwillingness to save her from what she needed to be saved from, that he is both an adult and he's the law within the town, and he does nothing at the time, bar sending her away, which probably did in some ways really help her, but obviously destroyed Molly.
Yeah.
So I think that he's included in the revenge.
Yeah.
In a way that in the film perhaps he's not.
No.
Yeah. What do you reckon?
Yeah, and I think you're right there, and I do like the scene when she gets the package and he turns up and he's quite excited by the package and he goes, I assumed May, I always knew May was looking out for her. Almost he sort of pushes the responsibility away. But I think Tilly says it's amazing what a bit of nourishment will do, and how I think she challenges him on that and the fact that he didn't play that role. And I think, again, that's part of the reason why, as you said, he's part of the punishment, the communal punishment at the end of the text. I sort of want to touch on the different styles that the authors use, or the playwright in Miller and the author in Ham. And when we talk about essay writing, I think it's really important that students do focus, not focus too much on just plot and characters, but also focus on the way these texts are written, because they're both very different. I might start with the Dressmaker, because I quite like a bit of the humour in there. We might start with the names, because they're pretty obvious.
Beulah Harradine is a classic one. I think she's trying on a little bit of a Dickensian situation here, like giving us those names that give us a sense of who the person is without necessarily having to give us backstories like Miller does. But Beulah Harradine, Beulah, I haven't looked up the meaning of the name, but the sound of it is sufficient for me. Have you?
Ferris.
Ferret?
Ferris Bueller.
Oh, Ferris Bueller. Yeah.
That's what I always think of. That's a name that I keep. That sandbot keeps coming up. Bueller.
You should insert that.
I will.
But Harradine, isn't that like
a conniving, gossiping woman?
Yeah, there you go.
And what is Beulah Harradine? And what happens to her? She goes blind after looking on everyone by a record player.
But it's fine because they put a note on her.
Yeah, that's right.
I just feel like that's so...
That's true.
That's so harsh. Trying to mitigate the effect of putting someone who's been blinded on a train by themselves.
I like the Dims. So we've got Prudence Dim, the teacher, who has taught for as long as anyone can remember.
Yeah.
And that highlights that rigidity, that lack of progress in the town, which also comes up with Hamish and his love of trains, which comes up a lot.
It does come up a lot.
Just start talking about trains out of nowhere. It's almost... like he's watched a YouTube clip. But
yeah, what chance do these kids have if they're being taught by someone named Dim and Prudence, the ways in which she goes through everyone's stuff and judges them accordingly.
And you've got Ruth, who doesn't pay the insurance but instead pays Tilly for dresses, and ultimately that means they don't have any money to rebuild. But I like, and you mentioned it before, is the way that Ham introduces the characters is so vastly different to that of Miller. It's the name and it's also the fashion, and I think that is something I would look into as a student, and it's something that I did on my third read, that I finally said, you know what, I need to work out what Georgette is, I need to work out what all these fabrics are, because they do play a role in describing who these characters are, or, in the case of later on in the text, who they want to be or what they want to appear like.
Absolutely. And that's where the naming becomes even more important, is when they're starting to pretend. You remember what their original names were. And even with characters who try and alter their names, there's that memory of where they started and who they started life as, which I think is quite interesting.
So with that, Miller, on the other hand, is very different in the way he introduces his characters. He's far more explicit. Mm-hmm. And we get really strong details about the characters, their backstories, their thoughts and feelings, their values, particularly the male characters. So I will say that Elizabeth doesn't get an introduction. Mm-hmm. Abigail gets 2 lines. Tituba gets 2 lines. I think Rebecca Nurse is the only female character in the text to actually get a formal introduction through Miller's commentary. Can we read anything into that?
I think so. I think we're still privileging that sort of male-led society in that way. But I think Rebecca Nurse, I like that she's singled out in that way, because Proctor looks to her, and we as an audience look to her in terms of how he should comport himself in those last sort of few moments. And it's because she is making the choice she is that he makes the choice he does. I firmly believe that. Yeah. Is that if she had chosen differently, that he would have kept on down the path of saving his skin rather than his soul. Yeah,
and he refers to her as a saint. Yeah. And that he can't mount the gibbet like that. Yeah. Which I think, again, Rebecca Nurse, perhaps a character that isn't referenced an awful lot, but one that definitely can be. Especially when we talk about moral integrity. And it's mentioned by so many characters. In fact, it's mentioned by Miller. And even Hale talks about the fact
Hale's
that
heard of her.
He's heard of her.
Yeah.
A woman in 1692. So I think that's something that I would definitely be looking at for sure.
And the fact that she brings people into the world. Like, she is this life-giving, life-sustaining force that is then rudely wrenched from the world by this sort of male judicial system. And
even particularly targeted by someone like an Anne Putnam, who confesses herself to sending her daughter to Tituba to conjure spirits. So the fact that Anne Putnam actually, or potentially the only person that actually confesses to actually doing witchcraft, yet she's not punished. In fact, her husband is the one that abuses the judicial system and gains quite greedily from this. I just remember my favourite quote from the Crucible as well.
Yeah.
You are a brainless man, Mr. Paris.
That is a great quote. And a great insult.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Great insult.
It is a great insult. But I think if I'm studying this text, I'll be looking at symbols as well and what they represent. So we spoke about fire before. We haven't spoken about it, but the idea of why it's called the Crucible. Yeah,
that in this, a crucible being used to melt down and purify metal. And these people, their true metal, but spelled differently,
nice,
is being extracted through this harsh process that they're going through, and you see who these people really are, which I think you also see in the Dressmaker.
100%, yeah, for sure. And it is, and again, it is internal forces that destroy both towns. Yeah. It really is, and that's a great bit of comparison. And I definitely call on all of you to really look at how an atmosphere, how an environment has such a big impact on how an individual, but also how a community acts when faced with challenges.
And the fact that they can't, that isolated, contained community is so integral in terms of the fear of the forest and native people closing them in, the fear of the unknown and the fear of the outside keeps them locked in the cycles and wheels that they're going through. Just back to characters for a quick sec. One of the things that really stood out to me upon reading The Dressmaker, and every time I read it, is the ways in which the character descriptions, the positive ones, are limited to 2 characters. That if you look at the physicality that Ham describes for every character, even Irma and Marigold, who we are meant to retain some sympathy towards, they are described in very sort of disgusting ways. And we see this in some ways with Arthur Miller. Neither of these authors are shy about letting us know how they feel about these particular characters. Yeah. Miller, obviously, much more directly through his authorial insertions, but I think if you go through, as I did, and take notes on every character, the descriptions are vastly different.
Yeah, correct. And that's where you as students can use that and discuss the way in which the authors want to convey meanings surrounding these characters, and they do it quite purposely. And we always need to think about why the author makes those decisions and what, as an audience, we gain from those, or maybe what we don't gain. Because I think Ham omits a lot of information as well. Particularly, the main thing she omits, and it comes up about halfway through the text, is what actually happened to Tilly. That is omitted. So we really still are questioning Tilly and how she views the world and her actions until we get that significant flashback of what Stuart Pennyman does to her. It's not until then that we actually get a full understanding of, okay, this is what happened to her and this is why she acts the way she does.
And I think the ways in which... I'd have to look back at the Crucible again, but Miller seems to describe people's actions, beliefs, and interactions with one another, whereas a lot of Ham's descriptions are about physicality and are about appearance, which then is meant to reflect the interior being of these people, which then plays really nicely into a lot of that symbolism and the ability of Tilly to start changing these people.
Yeah. And how Tilly, just before she goes to the ball, just before she gets literally locked out and her name scratched off, she tries to convince Teddy that, no, they're good people. You know, I'm doing a good thing here. And she does transform them physically, but unfortunately, not too long after she says that, their hatred comes out towards her.
Yeah, and it made me just think, you saying that, is that to what extent are we meant to take the epigraph seriously? So the sense of being well-dressed gives a feeling of inward tranquility which religion is powerless to bestow. Well, are we meant to take that at face value and say, fantastic, we are going to endorse this idea that being well-dressed makes us feel good, and that's the highest order of value that we can bestow and endorse? Or are we meant to be saying, zoom in on words like sense and feeling, so we're going for the feeling of inward tranquility as opposed to an actuality of inward tranquility? Yeah.
That's actually a really good quote, I think, and part of what Ham is trying to underscore is that very point, is that and it's a really good theme to analyse as well, this idea of appearance and deception, and how a lot of these characters try to deceive themselves. Is there something you'd like to finish on?
I just came to mind, I think we were talking about it the other day, just how much of a hell Danforth would find the dressmaker. Just in terms of the seeming. It is not what it is, but what it seems like. That everyone is, this pretense has run rampant through Dungatar. Dungatal.
Dungatar. Trudy.
Trudy. But yeah, everyone changing their names, changing their appearance, and pretending that changes their inner being, which obviously Ham points out it does not. No. So I just think that's a really nice... I kind of want to put characters from one and the other and just see what would happen.
Well, the character, when I think about Danforth, I think about Beulah.
Oh, yeah.
So Danforth is this official judge with both legal and religious power. And Beulah is this self-appointed judge of the town. And actually quite often she's wrong as well in the information that she spreads. The other thing I like about Beulah is when all the women are dressed up really nicely at the ball and she's wearing a cardigan. I think that's kind of nice. She just is so out of place. And she's like the school kid that just wants to play with everyone, but never gets picked. Yeah. She makes up about Trudy being only... something about Trudy being married for only 8 months. They've only been married for 8 months, but Ham showed us the wedding night and when they consummate their marriage, which isn't as satisfying as they hoped it would be. I think Trudy read it better in Women's Day or something like that.
Yes. Which, again, is really both funny and sad.
Yeah.
In terms of, that these people, the limit of knowledge in this town is such as they didn't get their year 10 respectful relationships, and sex ed talk. And so the limits of knowledge are the limits of experience.
Yeah, 100%. Well, thanks for joining me today. It's been a pleasure. We are going to come back. We're going to discuss essay writing, hopefully with another special guest at some stage over the next couple of weeks. But thanks everyone for tuning in. If you have any questions for us, maybe next time we might be able to answer those. So send them in to 6pspodcast@gmail.com. That's 6pspodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for being here, Ms. Chesterfield.
Thank you so much for having me, Mr. Sessions.
And if you would close me out by reminding our listeners that proper preparation prevents poor
performance.